For class example number 1, you're not allowed to use a calculator, but you don't really need one in this case. Let's take a look at A, the square root of 64. Now we know that 8 times 8, or 8 squared, is equal to 64. So the square root of 64 must be 8. For B, this is where things get a bit trickier. Let's take a look at it. We have negative 64. The key to remember is that in order to get a negative number, you're going to have to multiply a positive number times by a negative number to get a negative answer. Here's the problem. With negative 64, we'd need a positive 8 and a negative 8 multiplied together. Now, of course, the digits might be the same, but the signs are completely different. These are completely different numbers, so it's not going to work if we're going to take a square root. So, for negative 64, your answer here is going to be no real answer. For C, it's tempting to give the same answer as in B. However, you'll notice one thing that is a big difference between B and C, and that's the placement of the negative signs. For C, the negative sign is on the outside. When dealing with these kinds of problems, what you want to do is you want to focus on the radical itself. Treat this negative kind of like a negative 1 times whatever you get for an answer. Alright, so the square root of 64 is going to be 8. Now all you need to do, and this is why I put brackets in there just to remind myself, is multiply that negative by whatever's in the brackets. Your answer in this case is going to be negative 8. For D, we're dealing with cubed roots now. 4 to the power of 3 is equal to 64. So on the other end, the cubed root of 64 must be 4. For E, it might be tempting, considering what our answer was for B, and the fact that the negative sign is on the inside, to write no real answer. However, that's not the case because of that cubed root. If you recall, negative numbers times by a negative number times by a negative number will give you a negative answer. The reason is, if you multiply the first two together, you'll get a positive answer, because a negative times a negative is equal to a positive. However, of course, when you multiply it by that last one, you have a positive times by a negative, which will give you a negative answer as a result. Alright, so for E, the cubed root of negative 64, we know that negative 4 times by negative 4 times by negative 4 should equal negative 64. This is the same as saying negative 4 to the power of 3. So, when you take the cubed root of negative 64, that's going to be negative 4. That's perfectly valid. Last but not least, we have the cubed root of 64 with a negative on the outside. Alright, so just like in C, deal with the radical first and then apply that negative sign. So the cubed root of 64 is just going to be 4. Again, put brackets in there if you need to kind of remind yourself that you're going to be multiplying it by a negative sign. Or, of course, if it helps you out even further, put in a negative 1. Negative 1 times a positive 4 is just going to give you a negative 4.